all black everything, all black, you know, all black in the name of all my black heroes, all black everything, all black polos, all black medallions, yeah, all black, yo.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Miriam Thaggert, Associate Professor of English at the University of Buffalo. She is the author of Images of Black Modernism, Verbal and Visual Strategies of the Harlem Renaissance, published by the University of Massachusetts Press in 2010. She's also the co-editor of 2 volumes, A History of the Harlem Renaissance and African American Literature in Transition, 1920 and 1930, both published by Cambridge University Press. And we are joined today as she talks about her latest book, Writing Jane Crow, African American Women on the American Railroad, published by our friends up at the University of Illinois Press. Of Writing Jane Crow, Brittany Cooper writes, this well-argued, expansively researched book completely and powerfully reframes our understanding of the American Railroad through the eyes of previously overlooked Black women travelers and workers on the rails. The racialized politics of rail travel that this book so deftly illumes has given me new appreciation for the harrowing journeys of Black women reformers and laborers who showed us that it was not the building of trains or the laying of thousands of miles of track, but rather the choice to treat or not treat Black women riding those trains with dignity that mark the limits and possibilities of American progress. How are you doing today, Professor Thaggert?
I'm doing good. Thank you for having me.
So let me start. You are someone who's known for African-American literary history, literary criticism. On first glance, this strikes as a history book. But as you mentioned, early in the text, as you were thinking about these questions about the railroads and the Pullman porters and the Pullman cars, you went to the literature to get some record of accord about what was happening. So talk a little bit how you got to the journey in this particular project.
Thank you for that question. The book started when I came across an application of an African-American woman who applied to the Pullman company to be a Pullman maid. And originally the book was going to be a book on technology and African-American literature. I was really interested in technology like the telephone and the telegraph, and I wanted to examine how those different forms of technology appeared in African-American literature. And of course, another form of technology I was going to look at was the railroad. As I came across more and more references of Black women in the railroad, I started to ask questions about, why is it that I haven't heard more about Black women's experiences on the American Railroad? And one question led to another, and I ended up writing a book that includes literature as well as some history.
If you could unpack for the audience, because railroad travel feels like something that's part of a different moment, a different era. I personally love railroad. If I can take a train someplace, that's always my first choice, as it was for many African Americans who could afford it, a century ago to be able to ride trains. But for younger readers and audiences who don't have a relationship with the idea of Pullman porters or Pullman cars, who might not have had parents or grandparents, who worked on the railroad, literally, right, or worked in Pullman cars. Could you unpack a moment the significance of the Pullman cars and the Pullman porters to our sense of what African-American history is in this country?
Yes, so I think the Pullman compartment was important for African Americans, not only as workers, but also as writers. So the Pullman porters, I think most people are familiar with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters.
It ain't Philip Randolph.
Right. And really significant labor union. So being a porter was an important position in African American culture, even though there were a number of forms of discrimination that the Black men faced. It was an important role. There were leaders of their communities. A number of very prominent African-American men worked as porters when they were young. So the Pullman Company was really important for African-Americans as a source of employment. But the Pullman compartment also was important because it was a place where if African Americans could get the ticket, if they could ride in a Pullman compartment, they could avoid most of the forms of discrimination and harassment that a number of Black travelers faced while riding the train. So the Pullman compartment was important not only for people who are working for the Pullman Company, but also for those African American travelers, usually African American intellectuals like W.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, who had to travel for their different work causes.
And the railroad also was an important symbol for Black Americans, right? We know about the metaphor of the Underground Railroad, but the actual railroad, as we understand it, was an important symbol of mobility, and not just for Black Americans, for many Americans, right? It was symbolic of this opportunity to be able to see the country in a way that you hadn't been able to travel before, in terms of quickness and things of that nature. Talk about how significant it was as this vehicle of mobility for African Americans.
Yeah, I was really fascinated with the symbol of the railroad, the sort of mythological impact and resonance the railroad has in American culture. One thing I was really curious about trying to do was to sort of unpack, why it is that the railroad is so significant when we talk about some of these American narratives, narratives that help to define our country. And so I wanted to try to unpack this whole idea of progress. I think that is a term that is routinely used with different forms of American technology like the railroad. And I was curious to see, does that sort of mythological idea of progress, that symbolic idea of progress, is that the same sort of resonance of technology that Black women would have? And so, yeah, you're right. We have so many references to the railroad and the train in Black culture, not only the Underground Railroad, but also in our music, in our blues, in our poetry. Sterling Brown, Langston Hughes, they both use the sort of rhythm of the railroad in their work. So I was really attuned to trying to unpack how the railroad functions, not only in these sort of large scale American narratives, but also how it appears in Black culture. And so just tracing how the railroad appears in these different forms of African American culture.
You write in the book that the U.S. Railroad was the first mass form of technology that actively policed efforts to assert and maintain white political, social, and economic dominance. And given that narrative, you actually begin in a very contemporary moment, 2015, the Napa wine train. And one of the women who was forced to leave the train, and you can retell the story for the audience, but one of her responses was that she felt as though she was taken back into history, right? That she was reliving right, this kind of late 19th and early 20th century experience.
This has been just such a traumatizing experience for us.
This morning, the hashtag laughing while Black taking off like a runaway train after these 11 women say they were booted off the Napa Valley wine train for doing just that.
It was very humiliating, very, very degrading.
This was a very disturbing story, and I remember it vividly when I came across it. So there was an African-American women's reading group called Sisters on the Edge, located in the Bay Area of California. They decided to take a trip on the Napa Valley wine train, which would have been about a 3-hour trip through some of the scenic area of Napa Valley. And of course, they would drink wine and converse and just have a really good time. And unfortunately, when they entered the train car, they were seated in the back of the train car. There were employees who were admonishing the women that they were too loud, that they were laughing too loud. And eventually employees escorted the women off of the train car because of, they said that they were being loud and rude and abusive. Of course, that wasn't true. They posted this completely false statement on Facebook claiming that the women were abusive. And it was just a really startling incident, really hard to believe that this happened in 2015.
In my wildest dreams, never did I imagine that our annual trip to Napa would end up with us being kicked into a dirt lot in the hot sun to waiting police officers.
I said, what? Kick us off the train. I can't believe this. And sure enough, that's what they did.
The women did sue, and they settled. I start the book with that particular moment just to illustrate how some of the issues that Black female intellectuals were dealing with in the late 19th century, how they reoccur in this 21st century moment, so that we can see how some of the issues that women like Ida B. Wells were experiencing can sort of come back, rupture up to the present.
The book is broken down into 4 distinct archetypes of Black women, railroad travelers, or folks who have women who have experiences with the railroad. You've mentioned already the early Black intellectuals, Black female intellectuals who rode the train. You talk about, in 2 cases, Black middle-class women who end up having to sue railroad companies. You talk about, of course, the women who work as, and I had never heard this term before, who were basically handmaidens for travelers, Black women who were maids, cleaning Pullman compartments, right? And we'll go back to this in a moment, how they're literally not present in the archive, right? In the way that we celebrate, Pullman porters. And then these women who set up shop, selling food and what have you to folks, and how as the railroads expand and whiteness, kind of figures out, what some of these women are capable of doing and how they're sustaining themselves, they push back in certain kinds of ways. So could you unpack a little bit these 4 distinct kind of travelers and folks engaged with the railroad that you write about?
Yeah, I was really curious to look at African-American women's experiences, both as passengers and as workers. So I do start the book with Black women as passengers, looking at those Black intellectual women like Wells, Mary Church Terrell, Anna Julia Cooper, then Black women who sued to ride in first-class train compartments, sometimes known as ladies' cars. And of course, Ida B. Wells is probably the most well-known Black female intellectual to sue a railroad company because she was forced off of a first-class train car. But I also have sections on Black women who worked either near the railroad or in the Pullman compartment. So the Pullman company maids, and then a group of women known as the waiter carriers. These were African-American women who sold food near train stations. And I focused specifically on the women who worked in Gordonsville, Virginia. Some of your viewers may be familiar with Psyche Wilson Forson's book, Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs. This is a scholar at University of Maryland who does a sort of food studies examination of the waiter carriers in Gordonsville. And I was really interested in how the women were able to form this sort of this business, a really successful business selling food at a train station in Gordonsville, becoming very successful, becoming well known, not only throughout Virginia, but also throughout the country for their fried chicken. And because they were so successful, we see how a politician in Gordonsville sort of forced the women to close down their business. But before then, I was interested in how they were able to form this entrepreneurial spirit, this economic communal spirit by selling food and working together as a sort of collective.
I was fascinated with the story about the 2 women who sue the railroad companies, in the 1880s. The way that they recognize the reality of racial segregation and attempt to take advantage of gender segregation
Mhm.
right, by riding in the ladies' cars. And the way that the railroads respond to that, the courts respond to this, is that because the idea of Black women having autonomous mobility was so foreign a concept to them, the only way they could react to these women was to criminalize them as sex workers.
Mhm. Yeah, that was a really interesting, two very interesting lawsuits. So one lawsuit was initiated by a woman by the name of Jane Brown. She was located in Corinth, Mississippi, and she was forced off because the conductor assumed she was a prostitute. She sued, and fortunately, she won. She received about $3,000 in damages. The railroad company, however, kept appealing. It appealed twice. And of course, it was they were unsuccessful. But I was really interested in how the railroad company was able to make this argument that because Jane Brown was so mobile, because she was frequently seen about the train station, that somehow that sort of mobility created questions about her chastity. And so I was just really interested in how Black women who are highly mobile, especially around the railroad or the train, how they were perceived as somehow licentious, sexually available to white male passengers. So that was one of the things I was trying to look at in that particular lawsuit.
This book is about many things. Black women as travelers and laborers in the railroad. It is a history lesson in many ways. But more than anything, it's a book about the kinds of gaps and silences that occur in the archive.
Mhm.
Talk about the challenges that you face in writing about this book, trying to find people who were not women, who were not easily identifiable
Mhm.
in the archive.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's something that I really wrestled with while I was trying to write the book, because I have friends who are historians, and when I would tell them about the project, they kept asking me what is my evidence.
Right.
And I had to come back. Well, my evidence is that there's so many absences. There's so many holes in the stories we tell about the American Railroad. And so I was trying to make an argument that just as some African American women have been forced off of the American train compartment, especially the first class train compartment, there's a similar way in which African American women have been somehow forced out or removed from the sort of metaphorical and literal archives that we have about the American train in our culture. And just trying to link those two ideas together was one of the objectives of the book. And I'm really fascinated with this, I guess what we can call the sort of archival turn in African American studies, and trying to understand, how do we organize an African American archive? What does that archive look like? Is it only tangible objects? Is it only documents? Or can it be something, a term that you use, more ephemeral or intangible? And how do we collect it so that it is available for a wide variety of people? So just the questions of, how do we form an archive? How do we decide? What sort of decisions do we have to make about who is included and who is left out? I think all of those questions just really fascinate me.
And how did writing Jane Crow help you respond to those questions? How do you, for yourself as a researcher, as a scholar, as a writer, as a literary historian, right? How were those questions answered for you in the process of writing Jane Crow?
I think that it's really important to sort of investigate the margins. I think that, you can find information about these little known people just by, being sort of inventive and looking at the information that is available. So say, for example, I looked at the really large archive of the Pullman records at the Newberry Library. And there's not as much information about the Pullman maids as there is about the Pullman porters. But there is information about different women who worked for the Pullman Company in these Pullman employee cards. And these are about 4x6-inch employee cards that have information about some biographical information about the women and where they were born, their age, their addresses. And then on the backside, there's some information about their reprimands, like the moments in which they didn't follow the rules, so to speak, of the Pullman Company. And I found the back of these cards really interesting and really fascinating because I felt that you could really learn a lot about the women just by looking at what they were reprimanded for. So one of my favorite cards was some reprimands that a Pullman maid received on the Western line in California. This particular maid received so many reprimands because she was caught reading. She was reading in a train car where she should have been cleaning the ladies' restroom. At one moment, she was doing puzzles. Another moment, she's giving herself a manicure. And I just sort of identified with this particular woman who was trying to find all of these different moments in which she could take out a book and just read for herself, which I think is really an important image that we don't normally have in some of our readings of African-American women in literature and archives.
You asked a question in the book, how do we measure progress when the advancement of the race or the improvement in technologies leads to the erasure of Black women? I want to reframe that question and go back to something that you just mentioned, thinking about the archival turn in Black studies. How do we go forward in Black studies in this moment, given what has been a large erasure of Black women in the archive that Black studies draws upon?
Well, I think, I think you're doing something that it's helping to develop this archive, sort of like what you're doing with Left of Black. You're developing this sort of digital archive that people can refer to in the future that will help, future scholars of African-American history and culture to help answer some questions. So I think being able to take advantage of the technology that is now available, I think going to some of your elders and recording and getting that information about their experiences. I always tell my friends who have elderly parents that it's really important to capture their stories either on video or audio and just make the record. And it's really important to do it with, ordinary people. Like you don't have to go for the politician in your community, but, go to your mom, go to your pastor, go to your aunt and just record the stories about their lives while growing up. Their experiences with discrimination, their thoughts and ideas about some of the major events that took place during their lifetime. I think it's really important just to encourage people to record and document and get that information while their loved ones are still around and available and able to share their stories.
Talk a little bit about the photo that's on the cover of the book, which is very striking in many ways, because in some ways it's an image of Black women that we don't normally see. Talk a little bit about that photo.
Yes, this was a photo that I found at the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento, California. And I was looking through their archives, the Theodore Kornweibel papers, and there are a lot of postcards and Black and white photographs that are in this particular collection. And I remember when I found this photograph, and I remember just stopping and staring at this young woman on the side of a freight car. And I just love this image because the young woman, young girl, she's well-dressed, she has on these nice shoes, she has on stockings, she has on this really nice hat. And yet still she is just hanging off of this freight car like she owns it. And there's this little soft smile on her face. And I just thought that sort of paradox of this well-dressed young woman on the side of a freight car, I thought that sort of contradiction was just really appealing, and something that I hope my book also sort of interrogates, the sort of contradictions that we have about this sort of mythological power of the railroad in U.S. culture and the little known stories of Black women and their experiences with the railroad.
Professor Thaggert, talk a little bit about this idea of Jane Crow. And there's a way in which the term Jim Crow has been flattened. It gets thrown around and we just assume we know, or folks assume they know what it means without having a real kind of sense of the historic history of the term or the historical periods that it really captures. But the way that Jane Crow is a revision of that allows for a very unique gendered experience within the context of what we call Jim Crow.
Yeah, the term Jane Crow, there's various resonances I wanted to try to capture with that term. Not just the sort of feminized version of Jim Crow, but also I was tapping into the work of Pauli Murray, a lawyer, scholar, poet, priest, really dynamic individual. So Murray developed the term Jane Crow as a sort of legal term to help describe the discrimination that women face. And the term Jane Crow is really important for Pauli Murray. At one point, Murray thought about using that term for an autobiography that Murray was writing. And I wanted to sort of highlight how Murray was able to sort of revise, redefine how we think about gender discrimination. Murray, the individual, was important for the book because as I was doing research, I discovered that one of the few pleasurable places where I saw quote unquote female train writing was with Pauli Murray in some photographs and in a short essay that Murray wrote.
What's next for you, Professor Thaggert?
I am really sort of expanding my interest. I'm thinking about doing something on African-American women in the 1970s in popular culture. I'm really interested in the term welfare queen, which was a term that really became prominent in the 1970s. And I'm interested in looking at how that particular term has been wielded as a sort of weapon against African-American women. I'm also really interested in the poet Lucille Clifton, who is a poet from the Buffalo area. And I just always been really enamored with Lucille Clifton's poetry.
Yeah, she started her career at the Fredonia Normal School, which is where I got my undergraduate degree. We've been joined today by Professor Miriam Thaggert, Associate Professor of English at the University of Buffalo, my PhD alma mater, shout out. She's the author of Images of Black Modernism, Verbal and Visual Strategies of the Harlem Renaissance, published by the University of Massachusetts Press. She's also the co-editor of 2 volumes, A History of the Harlem Renaissance and African-American Literature in Transition, 1920 to 1930, both published by Cambridge University Press. And she joined us today to talk about her latest book, Writing Jane Crow, African-American Women on the American Railroad. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Professor Neal. I enjoyed it.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.